Welcome to Grief Chats with Dana and Mira, where we talk candidly about all things grief and widowhood. Grief is hard. Let's talk about it.
I'm excited for this episode. I think it's such an important one and really hard. Like, it made my stomach hurt.
It really makes me uncomfortable. Okay, let's start so we can actually talk about this. That's an important part of this conversation.
That's good.
Okay, so I'll start, right? Okay, welcome to Grief Chats episode 3. Today we're going to talk about how grief changes friendships and friendship loss. I think that this is one of the most common secondary losses. I don't know about you, Mira, but it's the one that I think a lot of people mention and struggle with. And I think it's also one of the most difficult of the secondary losses because you're not just grieving the loss of your person, you're grieving the loss of a person who's still living in that relationship. And as we're going to talk about today, is full of complexities and a lot of murky gray areas. Essentially, I think it's grief on top of grief. So today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. We're going to talk about some of the reasons that maybe friendship loss occurs after grief and some of the positive outcomes that can come. And then we're going to do mostly Q&A. We asked you guys a lot of questions on our Instagram, and you guys came up with so many good ones. So we're going to try and address as many of those as we can, and certainly some of the more common and what we think are the more difficult questions. We're going to try and tackle those. Mira, I know we talked about even just kind of outlining how this episode was going to go. We talked about how difficult it is for even you and me privately to talk about this and come up with examples, because it is so personal and so difficult because we are speaking about people that are still living in relationships that have shifted or sometimes disappeared. So have you, personally experienced that and struggled with that like the rest of us, it seems like?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. And I'm so nervous to talk about this because I think for me, I just worry so much about offending people. And I have had experiences since Brian died with friends where I have offended them, and it's been a really, really difficult part of the experience. So I think for me with friendship loss, it's so complicated because I think it's just natural that our friendships change after such a huge loss as losing our partners for so many reasons that we're going to get into in the episode. And it makes sense. It makes total sense because we are so different. And so how would any of our relationships with anyone feel the same as before? But it can be so hard to talk about. And for me, I have a lot of guilt within my friendships because maybe I haven't been able to maintain them in the way that I did before, or I always kind of prided myself on being a good friend. Like that was something that I felt really good about myself in my old life and my ability to be a good friend to other people and be a support to other people. And then when Brian died, I just felt like I couldn't be a support to other people in the same way I could before. And so many of my friendships didn't really fit anymore. And maybe they were triggering to me or I was triggering to them. Mm-hmm. And it was so challenging. And I felt really bad about that and really guilty about that.
When I think about this topic and friendship loss and changes, and there's so few that I feel like I've repaired. So it's just really hard when it's people that care about you, but then there's a level of anger and resentment and guilt and all of these negative feelings that come with trying to figure this out, on top of being really, really sad all the time and having no energy. And frankly, I think that's where I was at, where it's like, I don't have the capacity to hold these friendships in the way that they probably need. And same with you, a lot of guilt for that, of not being, also priding myself on showing up and being a good friend and knowing I did not. And I've had friends tell me and really hurt my feelings of like what a shitty friend I was essentially after Brad died, and being like, yeah, I know I was, and that still really hurts my feelings.
And also for me, like that makes me feel even more isolated and invisible. I'm like, if you only knew
Yeah.
how painful this is in so many invisible ways, you would never say that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just
Exactly.
feel like, gosh, like I'm so alone in this.
Mhm.
And then the friendships feel even more distant and more separated, because how can you ever understand this experience that I've gone through now? And so much of our friendships is based on like mutual understanding and shared experiences. I feel, especially when we're young, like it's like, chatting about guy troubles, or,
Yeah.
for me, it's a lot of like mom stuff. And
Mhm.
I don't know, I feel like I can't really relate to those conversations anymore as an only parent now.
Mhm.
And I know because we've talked about this before, that then you also feel that way as being like somebody who didn't have kids. And, there's so many things like that. And I think grief just adds on to those sort of, friendships are changing. We're becoming more different. We're having different life experiences. And
Mhm.
it's harder to relate sometimes. And going through something like such a traumatic loss, it just, of course, it severs things. And then it's so complex and murky working all of that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think also it can be complicated by the fact that, like, when it's a partner that you've lost, like both of us,
Mhm.
because we were with our partners for a long time. A lot of our friendships were built in partnership with
Yeah.
them. Like, we had so many couple friends or people that were friends with both of us together, and
Yeah.
so then that the relationships are so changed. But then also they are also grieving the loss of Brian too. So for them to then be a support to me on top of their own grief, some of them I found just couldn't. Like,
Yeah.
and I was a trigger to them because I reminded them of Brian.
Yeah. And I really feel that's the case. Yeah, with friends, with mutual friends. I had a good friend who was one of Brad's best friends, and after Brad died, immediately, showed up, and I'd get together with him and his wife, and they'd cry every time, like every time they saw me, like we'd be out at a bar grabbing a drink, or like every time, and I now have not talked to them in years, and I like they just stopped, and I think, and it's one that I can understand a little bit more because I'm like, I know I visibly saw how hard it was that I was the reminder of their loss, and as much as they wanted to be there for me, they couldn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt less for me. Like, I
Yeah.
still miss those relationships, but I at least can understand where they're coming from.
Maybe one more thing before we get into some of the main reasons why friends
Mhm.
disappear, because this has been a big part of it for me in terms of fear of talking about it, is that I've been reading a little bit more about children's grief recently, and a lot of the time for kids, I know that the loss of a parent can feel like abandonment, even though it's not. And so it's kind of got me thinking about even our loss as adults. I think
Mhm.
sometimes it feels like, I know cognitively Brian didn't abandon me, but it sometimes feels like it in my soul
Yeah.
because it was so traumatic and it was so sudden. And so I think that there is this sort of fear when you're already living in this abandoned kind of state, that if you do tell friends when what they're saying isn't working, or if you do address things with them, that you will then push them further away, and that
Mhm.
you will then be more abandoned. And
Yeah.
so I think for me that definitely relates to my fear sometimes of saying things, is like, I don't want to push people further away because I've already lost so much, and it really complicates things a lot, I think.
Well, I think it's why this is such a hard topic, because it's one that I really feel like I haven't figured out, and am not always living up to the way I want. And so I feel like this episode is a lot of like, this is what I've learned and what I feel. And if I was like the human being I want to be, how I would respond and what I would say. But I'm still working through it and struggling with it. And and maybe we'll watch this again and be like, yes, I can do this now. Who knows? If any of my friends are watching and feel abandoned, or like we have a rift in our friendship, I'm open. I'm gonna not put it on other people.
Also, though, I think it's important for us to, I mean, you're 4 years out. That's a lot. I mean, to me, it seems like a lot. To me, it seems like a lot compared to me. And I'm like, it must be different now to look back and be like, oh my God, I could have done things differently at the beginning. But like, we also have to have so much grace for ourselves because, like, remember the first year? Like,
Yeah.
remember how fucking painful it is beyond anything. Like, I just feel like I need to completely give myself grace that first year. I didn't do anything like brutally horrible. Yeah, there were so many moments I'm not proud of, but I just am trying so hard to like not have that guilt and that those feelings of like you fucked up because we were dealt like the shittiest blow. And
Right.
like,
But I think part of it being 4 years out is also like, oh gosh, like so much time has passed. And I think it's accepting like that there will naturally be a shift in relationships as we get older, as we go through life experiences. We're not always supposed to have the same relationships in our life forever. And being okay with that, but I still have a lot of like sadness and guilt. Even, I mean, because I think in the first year, it's like, yeah, I was shit and couldn't show up, but I wanted other people to show up for me. And I harbored some anger and resentment for a long time and then finally accepted it's like these relationships have shifted and that's okay. But in that capacity of 4 years feeling like a really long time also makes me feel like maybe I should have, like, once I got out of that crazy fog of grief and initial early grief, like could have reached out or could have had these conversations. And so often I didn't. So I think that's just, I don't know, always room for growth.
always room for growth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also it's not easy.
And it's not easy. None of this is easy. Yes. Thank you for that reminder. So the first one that we have, I think is, at least for me, feels the most common is that they don't know what to say or do. So they avoid us or they disappear completely. I think that seems to be like when I think about my friends and how they've shifted, it starts just with this kind of initial discomfort and avoiding the topic. They're afraid to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. They don't want to hurt us more. And like we've talked about in other episodes, this fear of not showing up in the right way, so they just don't show up at all. And that's the one I think I understand the most. Still is hurtful, and go back and watch episode 2 of Grief Chats because we talk a lot about it. But I think that's what I've noticed the most, at least in my life.
100%. And I think that it's good that we put this one first because for me, this is sort of like the initial thing that happens. Like when Brian died, when Brad died, like this was the one. And then it's a domino effect of all these other things that happen because of that initial thing and how that affects us and then how we respond. And like, but that's sort of like the first main thing.
Yes. Such an excellent point. Yeah.
And I remember when Brian died, I have this one friend, she's so awesome. And she just like immediately she's like a researcher and she immediately went into research mode. And she came to me like a few days after he died and she was like, hey, Mira, I've been doing some research on, young widowhood. And a lot of widows, you lose a really large percentage of their friends within the first year. And I just want to warn you, you have to be prepared for this. And I was like, that's not going to happen to me. That I'll be the exception to that rule because Brian and I had such strong friendships. We both had such strong friendships. It's not going to happen to us. Like I totally thought I was this like one exception. And yeah, like all of those, that totally happened to me. It happens to everyone.
I wonder if like people that are watching this early on, like, cause I feel like I would have had that same reaction if someone had said like, most of your friendships are going to change. Like, I mean, I think every friendship changed. A lot will disappear if I would have felt the same way. And like, maybe it's a good warning though for people early in grief to be like, it's be prepared.
And that's such a good point because I think that it does take some time. Sometimes it does take some time to actually realize, oh, my friendships have actually shifted. Like this is a phase. Things have shifted dramatically overall.
Right. When you've been stuck in a hole for a year and you kind of emerge a little bit like looking out and then you're like, oh, everything looks different now. Like who is showing up? Who's not showing up? Who's around still? It's all changed.
Lives have gone on. People's lives have moved on and changed and, then they're hurt or offended and that has changed a lot of stuff too, I think.
Yeah. For sure.
But it does take some time to really realize that, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so number two is our pain is too hard for them to handle, or maybe brings up unresolved pain for them. And I think that this one, yeah, it's kind of connected to number one in a way. It's like, I mean, it's really painful what's happened to us. And for a lot of people, in order to be friends with us, it would mean sort of engaging with that pain, at least for me, because I was not the kind of person who, everybody grieves differently. But for me, I wasn't the kind of person who was like, I want to go out with my friends and just like have fun and drink and pretend that nothing happened.
Yeah.
I was like, I want friends around who are going to go there with me and who are going to be comfortable with me in my grief authentically. And for a lot of people, they can't do that for whatever reason, for a multitude of reasons. And it could be that they have experienced something really hard in their past that they are triggered by now by me. And,
you're a reminder of it.
and they can't go there. It's too hard for them. And so they need to have their boundaries. And unfortunately, part of that means not engaging with me.
Right. Do you feel like in that situation, they should say something?
Totally. Okay, I think you don't need to get into all the details. I think it's an issue in early grief when people start to overtell you why. Like, well, I can't work with you because like when I was a kid, this happened to me, and it's just like, no. You don't need to get into all those details at the beginning. It's too overwhelming. But I think I did have a few friends say things like, I really wish I could be there for you right now, and I want to know my heart, but I can't. And I want to be there for you long term. And then reached out and did other things, like more practical things.
Yeah.
Involve actually sitting with me and listening to my grief. And I do have friends who are I'm not really sure because I'm only 2 years out, but I feel like there is hope for some of those friendships, you know?
Yeah. And I think that's such a beautiful way to address it, like to talk about that. And like you said, to then show up in other ways. Okay, number three, our loss reminds them of their own mortality or of their partner's mortality. Most people don't like being reminded that they're going to die or that their partner is going to die. And unfortunately, we as young widows, as widows in general, are living, breathing billboards, everyday reminders that shit goes wrong and shit happens and death is happening. And I think that is too much for people who don't want to go there.
Yes, totally agree.
Yeah.
Okay. Number 4. They expect us to go back to the person we were before, or they are uncomfortable with the changes in us. I think this is a big one. Comes up a bit later. So, yeah. I feel like the other ones, it's like more at the beginning. And then this one is the one that kind of, it happens over time where people start to realize, oh, Mira's not just going back to who she was before. She's different now.
Yeah.
And some people don't like that because they liked who I was before, which was different than who I am now. And also the expectation that I can feel that they want me to go back to who I was before is really hard on me too, because I don't feel like that's healthy for me. And I'm like really resisting the urge to just kind of, okay, I'm just going to go back to who I was before, which would feel fake and inauthentic. And like I'm trying to almost like create this pretend sort of version of my life before, but without Brian, which is not gonna work for me at all. So it just feels like pressure. And I've actually had a lot of people tell me that they feel like they are grieving me as well as Brian. And I never know how to take that because I get it, but sometimes it feels a little bit like then I feel guilty because maybe I could, just sort of to appease everyone, try to be more like who I was.
You can't. You can't. And that's, I think, when it takes effort. Like if the friendship is worth having, if your friendship, it takes effort to get to learn this new you. And, I'll just jump into the next one because I think it's connected to that we can no longer relate to them or the friendship just doesn't fit anymore. And because so often we do change and the things that we used to talk about, maybe are not things we can talk about. It's like you said, of being a parent, or talking about boys or husbands driving us crazy, or sometimes even what feels like superficial conversations that I used to love being a part of, but then was like, I can't handle this anymore. And especially early on, where I feel like maybe you were similar, but not everyone grieving handles it this way. Some people love these like wonderful distractions. I only wanted to be with people that were willing to go deep, even if it wasn't about loss or Brad. Like, I had zero patience or tolerance for the shallow shit in life. And that's hard when your friends just want to be light and fun. And I've, brought in more of that light and fun sense, but it shifted a lot of relationships where I'm like, we don't relate on the same level. I don't fit in with you anymore. And it's not like we had that conversation. It's just, that's when I noticed those friendships just kind of drift apart naturally, as a result of that.
Yeah, for sure. I was the same.
Yeah, I kind of figured.
Yeah, totally. Okay, number 6 is friends misunderstand our inability to respond to texts, talk on the phone, or engage in the friendship as we used to. They think it means that we are offended by them or need space, so they stop reaching out. We talked about this one a lot in episode 2 as well, but I think that it's important to note because I really do think this is at the root of why a lot of friends that maybe initially do reach out stop.
Yeah.
Because they feel offended. And I've had a lot of people tell me this, so I know it's a common thing. Actually, there was one person, one of Brian's friends, who literally disappeared for like a year. And when we finally reconnected, it was all based in the fact that he thought he had offended me. And I was like, what? No, like you were like no offense, but you were like the last thing on my mind. Like,
right.
I was grieving the loss of my entire life. Like, I don't remember what I said to you, but no,
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why this is so complicated, because we have two different perspectives and two different narratives happening. And so often they're not coming together. Like, that's so great that he was able to say that and you guys could have that conversation. But even the like, how are you, like, check-in text messages that are appreciated. I see them and appreciate them, but I'm like, I don't have the energy to, or like, answer this or go down in my mind of, do I tell you the truth of how I'm feeling? Do I lie and say I'm fine? And then by the time I'm just like, I'm exhausted even in my mind of this. And so I don't respond. And eventually they just stop because they're like, oh, I'm probably bothering this person. And so it's just, there's so many misunderstandings that happen, especially over technology and attempting to communicate and be there. And it makes sense. It makes sense. And so I do think you're right. Like how we've talked about, just keep showing up and keep doing it in ways that you can address that a little bit better. Because it's hard.
So now we just wanted to kind of like sneak this in here a little to spice up the conversation just a tad.
Spice it up.
Most of it is based in, the ways that we go through immense loss in the realm of friendship after losing a partner or another, huge person in our life. But we wanted to put this in here, just sort of a little bit about how going through a profound loss can actually change our friendships, sometimes unexpectedly in positive ways, too, which is kind of a cool thing to add in, I think. So we're going to go over that a little bit, too.
Yeah. I think it is one of the most beautiful things that have come from grief, is to think about the friends that I have and how they've shifted for the better. So I just love that we're going to talk about this, even though most people that wrote in, it was about the difficulties, which is why we will spend most of our time on this. But I think it is important to talk about the positive stuff. So one of the first positive outcomes that comes from friendships after grief or loss or during grief is we begin to better understand and respect our own boundaries, which means that we learn to be more direct and say what we need within our friendships. And this is something that I've personally struggled with always, as the people pleaser, peacemaker, like say yes to everything and then silently resent people or flake or whatever. there's been so much growth personally in terms of not having time for the bullshit or to say yes when I don't have the energy. And I think it makes me a better friend. I think it allows my other friends to be direct with me back, and it just creates a more honest back and forth relationship.
For sure. I found this one too majorly, and I think I always had a really hard time with boundaries. I've always struggled a lot with boundaries because I don't want to hurt people's feelings, and
Mhm.
grief, just I didn't give a shit. Like I was just
Yeah.
like, I need boundaries. Like I've never
Yeah.
needed them the way that I need them
Yeah.
now for
Yeah.
survival. And so learning boundaries has sort of been like one kind of benefit of going through the most horrible thing ever.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For sure.
appreciate that. But yeah, the second one is often I think in our grief we sort of become a little bit less tolerant of the friends that maybe actually weren't very healthy for us, and this can be a good thing. It is a tricky thing to talk about, but as you were saying, Dana, earlier on in the episode, I think that as we get older and as we go through different and more complex things in our life, it is natural for our friendships to shift and change. But for a long time, I think I really clung and hung on to a lot of friendships because of shared history. And that's beautiful, I think, to a certain extent. But sometimes there are friendships that just don't feel like they are healthy any longer.
Mhm.
But in my life before with Brian, I would totally just always make time for them. And in grief, it became a little bit more apparent, okay, who actually isn't healthy for me now and who is. And that's been really beneficial.
Yeah, I think it makes it easy. I'm gonna use that term. Probably, it probably doesn't make sense, but it makes it easier to weed out those people of your life because you literally don't have the energy. Like you don't have the energy and space for it. And so it's like when you hang out with people, you don't want to hang out with people. Like anyway, I didn't want to hang out with anyone, but I certainly didn't want to hang out with people that weren't healthy or made me feel like shit.
Exactly. Exactly. I was going to say weed out, and then I was like, what's a nicer way of
I
saying
know.
it? So I'm so glad you said it because it was on my mind. Like, you read my mind. I was like, weed out.
I mean, it does feel terrible to say.
But it's,
That's how it feels.
I mean, I don't know. I found like my body, my gut literally told me, like, this
Yeah.
is somebody who I cannot spend time with right now.
Yeah.
And it was just so obvious and glaringly obvious in a way that it was not before.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So the last positive outcome that we're going to talk about is the intimacy of grief can strengthen friendships with those who stick around and also help us find new friends who are better aligned with who we are now. So grief actually helps us build up a really strong network of friends who truly know how to show up and sit in it with us. And I think the people that make it through it or that come into your life when you're grieving are just full of depth and compassion and empathy. And I feel like the people that are in my life that have made it through with me are it. Like we're gonna, and maybe it'll shift again with the next traumatic thing that happens in life for one of us. But I feel like the bond I have with people in my life is just really beautiful.
Me too. Me too. The friendships are so strong. I mean, yeah, if you're the kind of friend who's gonna, move towards somebody who's gone through something like this instead of move away from them and just keep trying and keep showing up, I mean, that's you. That's a beautiful person right there.
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, I love that word intimacy because it's true. Like, I just feel like within my friendships that have maintained, there is an intimacy that I didn't have with my friends before.
Mhm.
Because, well, firstly, because Brian isn't here. And so he used to be, my go-to person. And now my friends have kind of stepped up and become more important in a way. But then also just by nature of going through something as intense as this loss with me, our friendships are deeper than my friendships were in the past.
Yeah, you're going through something really hard together. I mean, they're going along with you and the hardest part of your life. So that's a lot to handle. So if you can do that and show up as a friend in that way, I mean, I have so much respect for anyone that's doing that for anyone struggling.
Okay, so Q&A time.
Q&A. Okay, so this is from all of our Instagram friends. And there's so many good questions. I was just so impressed with what people came up with. So our first one is, within your grief, when you are upset by a friend's insensitive comment, do you tell them that they hurt you? And if so, how? And then what do you do if they become angry or defensive? So maybe you can answer those in a couple parts because there's a lot in that question.
I know. It's I mean, it's the main one. That's the biggest one. That's the one we got like in different wording,
Yeah.
tons of times, and it's the hardest one to answer. Um, and I think we also touched upon this a little bit in episode 2. And I think for me, it really depends on the specific situation. So I had some friends who said insensitive things to me where I was just like, is this worth me saying anything? Is this a friendship that I want to work on? Because every time you say something, you are opening yourself up to a dialogue. When you open up the dialogue, you are then opening yourself up to a conversation that might be tricky. And there might be things that they might get offended by. It might be hard to get into. And so for me, I kind of had this problem where I always wanted to say something. Like it was like I needed to. And a lot of the time it would just take so much out of me. And sometimes it was with people that it was not worth it. And like, so over time I have had to really start to remind myself that you don't always need to say something. Sometimes you can just say, this is a relationship or a friendship that I don't really feel it is worth it to spend this energy and time on, or maybe later on when I am feeling stronger, I can address this. But it's such a hard one for me because then I feel this feeling within me of like being silenced in my grief, and it really bothers me. So I usually say something.
I mean, I feel like it builds up if not. And I'm a person who historically have not said something and have been like enraged. And it's like, maybe if I just said something, they would have understood and we could have moved on. And I think you're right that the situation really does matter. And is it the second part of that question, like, what do you do if they become angry or defensive? It's like, read the room, like who is saying it, what is, their intention? Can they have the conversation from a place of understanding? Am I in the place to have a conversation from a place of understanding and compassion? I think both parties have to be in the right mindset to be open to the fact that you're saying something hurtful, like both ways. And it's such a hard one because you don't know. You can't predict someone else. You don't know how that conversation's going to go. I think saying something is great, and I know it's so hard. Like I struggle with it.
Yeah. But what do we do? What do we do if they become angry or defensive? It's so hard. What do you do in that situation? This happened to me. And I mean, oh my God. That's what made me regret it. I was like, it's happened to me a few times because I have said something quite a few times and people have gotten angry and defensive, and it hurts. It really, really hurts. You know what? It hurts a lot in the moment, but then after the fact, I feel good that I said something, especially the more I connect with other grievers. Even just talking about these things with you, it always helps me because then I'm like, okay, I feel like it was good. I said something. And kind of back to one of the positive points that we had of, it kind of weeds out people. Like in a way, it's like, if I tell you, and I mean, I'm not cruel. Like I intentionally try to say things with compassion. And if you're still getting angry and defensive with me, I mean.
Yeah, maybe you're not in the place to be able to be there for you right now. And maybe that's okay.
Yeah. And it's hard. And I think that this is why there is so much friendship loss when you lose a partner. This is why. This is part of it. It's not as simple as people disappear. It's not that simple. That's the point. It's more complex. Sometimes they said something you said something back, they got angry.
Yeah.
And that's why the friendship isn't working out anymore. Like sometimes it's that, right?
Right. And maybe they are showing up, and if they got angry or defensive, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to back off now because I can't deal with their anger when I'm just trying to express myself. And so it's not always them that's pulling away. Sometimes you need to pull away.
Exactly. Totally. And that's why it's complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes the anger is just, I'm like, it's too much. Like, I don't have the energy for that. I'm still trying to figure out my life. And maybe as more time goes on and my life is a little bit more settled, because everything in my life is still so up in the air. And like, I don't have the time for this. I don't have the time for this still. I'm still trying to figure out all this stuff in my life and how I'm going to move forward. And, to you, this might feel like the biggest thing. But to me, it's like one thing of a million that has fallen apart.
Right. That's such a good point.
When you are deep in your own overwhelming grief, how do you hold space for your friends' woes?
Oh, this is another hard one. And again, I feel like all of these I answer, I'm going to be like, well, I didn't do this. like I feel like I couldn't, and I had to be okay with that, especially early on. I can't hold space for, especially, and this is going to sound so terrible, but like, if your woes aren't death related, if it's not grief on some traumatic level, I can't hold space. Like, and I want to be the best friend for my friends, but I couldn't. Like, especially I couldn't. And I think now I'm better about doing it, but I think it's okay, and I want people to understand that are friends that are grief adjacent to understand that if somebody is deep and overwhelming grief, as this person has mentioned in their question, they more than likely will not be able to hold space for you, and it's not personal.
Yes, exactly. And then also the timeline here is really important. Like understanding that it's not just a few months. I
Yeah.
think people were kind of understanding of that for the first few months, and then it was like, oh my God, she's still not able to talk with me about my issues with my partner. And it's like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Still not going to be able to talk with you about your issues with your partner. And it's been 2 years.
Right. I was like, it's hard for me now to create that space. And I think that's where it's like, we have different friendships for different parts of our lives. And I think in this capacity, a person who's deep in their own grief probably isn't the person to go to with, issues with your boyfriend.
Yeah, no, definitely not. This was a really hard one for me too. Yeah, and I think I totally agree with what you said. I think it just needs to become normalized that when you go through a traumatic loss, you will not be able to be in a supportive role for your friends for a while. But I do think that for the friends that did stick around, I think that I am over time becoming a better friend to the people who did stick around, and my capacity for like compassion and empathy and understanding and being able to sit in the hard stuff is coming back. There's certain things that are still really, really triggering, like problems with your boyfriend. But I think overall, I'm noticing now, especially for the friends who really did, for me, I am like, God, if you have a problem, like I'm here for you 100,000,000% to hold that space. So I think it's worth it.
I think that's such an important point, and I think especially as we get further out, like that perspective matters. And you're right. I think about some of my girlfriends now, and they're dating, and they're on Tinder, and they're having like all of these adventures, and sometimes like really big disappointments. And I can sit and have these conversations and hold their grief over failed relationships because I'm 4 years out now. It's not so raw, and I also feel like I have this safety with them to say, hey, I really can't do this right now because I'm struggling. And I think that's the beauty of those relationships. Again, if you have made it through it, you can create that space for each other, but you can also say, I can't do this. I would love to do this another time. And I think that's really important.
Totally. Yeah.
How did your relationships with your partner's friends change after you became a widow? And we also got kind of related to that. How did have your relationships with your couple friends changed?
Yeah. So yes, unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
Very much so. Yeah, this has been a hard one because when you lose your partner, I feel like a lot of us, I just like craved connecting to Brian's friends because they reminded me of him and
Yeah.
they had stories about him. And unfortunately, a lot of those friendships and relationships really changed. I think I would be so interested to hear their perspectives on this, but I think a lot of it has to do with what we talked about before of like me being triggering to them.
Yeah.
As Brian's death was so traumatic for everyone. And I have talked about this with one of his closest friends, and we have talked about because he disappeared for a year
Yeah.
after Brian died. He literally like looked at me at Brian's funeral and promised me, I will be there for you. I will not disappear. And then literally disappeared.
Yeah.
And when we reconnected a year later, that's what came up was like, he was just like, I was grieving so hard and I thought I could push it aside and be there for you. And I couldn't. And I
Yeah.
so much. And it was like, not only the loss of Brian, but also this sort of like blowing open of your universe of like, this can happen. You
Yeah.
know, somebody like everybody knew Brian was like the healthiest, most vibrant, most health conscious, kindest, you know, most just like a good guy, you know, like a good person. And I think for something like this to happen to someone like that, just he had so much integrity. That's what people
Yeah.
love about Brian. He had so much integrity. And it's true. And it's like for something like this to happen to someone like that, I think it really does freak a lot of people out. So I think that's a big reason why a lot of his friends in particular disappeared. And then also because like Brian was the glue that held me to them. And so did it always work for me to then have a friendship with them? Not always.
Right.
And then in terms of the couple thing, yeah, that's also been a really, really sad one because a lot of our friends were couple friends, and I mean it's tricky because I know one of Brian's friends reached out to me at one point and he said, "I'm sorry I haven't been in touch with you more. I'm worried that I'm triggering to you." I mean, it makes total sense, and he was, but also I kind of wanted to be like, well, if you made more of an effort to not talk about your wife like every single time we connect and not constantly use the word we instead of I, maybe it wouldn't be quite so true. Like maybe we could make it through, you know, like you're not really willing to do the work of making those shifts, but also, so I think it was probably more than that. Like I think it was also, as is always, it was more complicated, more complex, more layered. Like I was also triggering to him, obviously.
Yeah.
But I did appreciate he said it, and I was like, that makes sense. You know, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, I think I agree completely with Brad's friends, and I think it's very similar in what we talked about already. But I think with the couples, I have similar experiences, and I've talked to other people, and I know we talked a little bit about this the other day when we were kind of planning this episode about the idea that now you're suddenly single and you're a threat, and like what a weird, like bizarre space to be in that like made zero sense to me because I was like, no, like I'm so sad and depressed. I do not want your husband. Like, there is no interest here.
When you brought it up when we were planning the episode, I was like, honestly, I was like, I've never thought about that before. But obviously, that's part of it, and it's just like, what? No, no.
Right. It just felt like another thing that I had to deal with that felt unfair.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's just like one extra thing. I'm like,
one more thing.
No, I'm not. That's
right. Right.
No. Do you think that your loss has helped you be a better, more supportive friend to the people in your life who endure tragedy? And would it have helped you to have a you, Dana, back when you first lost Brad?
I mean, we talked about this already a little bit. I do think it has helped me to be a more empathetic, supportive friend. I think, especially with somebody who's going through loss, I know to actually think about what I say, not just say whatever, so sorry for your loss or whatever comes out of my mouth, like everyone else says. Let me know what I can do.
Yeah.
I actually think about it in terms of like that specific person. And again, kind of what we talked about before too, I also feel like maybe I'm also not great with people who weren't there, or feels like their shit is trivial and maybe they'd say I'm a worse friend. Like, but I think overall it has helped me to be a much better human being and a much better friend. And what was the second part? Would it have helped me to have a you? I mean, I would have loved to have anyone, I mean, Mira, a you, like anyone to just be open about, like anyone that was feeling what I was feeling and open to the conversation would have been extremely helpful. So I don't know if me personally, because then I would have felt equally of loss, but somebody that would have been through it and knew how to have these conversations, even without the answers, yes, would have been helpful.
100%. I agree. Yeah. I think the sentiment of this question is like somebody who has been through this type of a loss and understands. And yes, for sure. Like I think about this all the time. I'm like, I remember when Brian died, I just wanted to find friends that were also widows. And it took a while to find them. And like, yeah, it would have been so helpful to like know you when Brian first died. Like, holy shit, it would have been amazing. Yeah. It took time. I felt so alone for the first little bit. And I would have loved to have somebody who understood. And yeah, I agree with everything you said.
How do you deal with friends ghosting you after a loss? Do you let them back in if after a year has passed, they suddenly start reaching out again?
Yeah. So this happened to me. I think it depends so much on the friendship. I think that you really have to sit in that moment and be like, is this a person who I feel in my heart it is worth doing the repair right now? Because there's going to be repair, because there's going to be hurt, and there's going to be you're going to have to be honest about that. And how are they going to respond? And is it going to be more effort? And where are you right now in your grief journey? Are you ready to take that repair, or are you not? And I think it's important to also remember that grief doesn't end after the first year. So just because you are now able to engage in that conversation, are you able to actually maintain a friendship with that person now? Are they actually willing to rebuild and change, or are things just going to kind of continue the same? Like with this friend that this did happen to me with almost exactly, and after a year I did connect with him and I did have a conversation with him and I was honest and he did respond well, but nothing really changed.
Yeah.
So he's still not really able to be there for me. I hear from him a little bit, but not really. And so, I mean, I think that's important too, is like, I think there might be a little bit of hope there that maybe now that the year has passed, you will be back to you from before. And if you're not, are those issues going to continue?
Yeah. And I was thinking the same thing about with the year specifically in this question of like, is that implied that you're better? And like, so now they want to come back in and be like, there is no going back. And we've already talked about it, but they have to get to know the new you and be open to that version. And maybe you're not supposed to be friends anymore, but I think anyone that's willing to reach out and wants to, I'm open to it, but I also am like, we might not have the same friendship that we had because we're both different, and I'm certainly different. And I think there's a level of understanding that I certainly have now that I maybe didn't have early. So
how do you handle it when no one talks about your person anymore? I don't even know how to interact with these people now.
Oh, I think that's so hard. I think in my experience, people that don't mention Brad's name, like literally avoid his name. Like, gosh, I feel like they are worried they're still the people that worry if he is mentioned, it's going to lead to this like really dark space and I'm going to cry and it always has to be heavy. And instead of realizing how wonderful and beautiful it is when you casually mention Brad, when you're like, hey, remember that time we did this, or I was reminded of Brad because of this, and what a joy that is. And so I struggle a lot if you're not mentioning Brad's name, if you're not mentioning him like at all, especially like you knew him, if you were somebody that was friends with both of us, it would be hard to interact. And I'm guessing that, in my experience, I actually don't really interact with those people. Those are kind of naturally the people that, for all the reasons we've talked about, aren't really in my life in the same way. And the people that are in my life know to bring up Brad, tell me stories, aren't afraid of my grief, and also know that it can be a lot of fun and tell jokes and, shit on Brad a little bit too. Like, that don't hold him up on this like pedestal, and like even remind me of his flaws. And I love that just as much also. So
Yeah, I love that you said that. I feel the exact same way. Like when I saw this question, I was just like, those people aren't in my life. But I think the caveat is you do have to tell them, because sometimes people don't know. And like we said in episode 2 a lot, like grief literacy is something by no fault of our own that none of us know about. But I think if you've been honest and said, I do like it, just so you know, I really like it when people talk about my person. And if they still don't after you've told them, yeah, I mean, that's not worth it.
How do you explain to friends that some conversations are triggering, like pregnancy and husband conversations?
I've done this a lot. I just do. I just do it. I just tell them. Like, I just am direct and honest, and it's really hard and tricky. I think also for me, maybe it's been a little bit, probably for you too, it's been a little bit through our writing. Write publicly and very openly about this. I mean, I wrote a ton about this in the first year, and sometimes it was like a bit of a passively aggressive way to tell people, like, please don't always talk about your babies and your pregnancies around me, because this is a huge part of my loss. Because maybe they didn't know, maybe it wasn't passive aggressive, but it was like an easy way to tell a bunch of people without having to tell them all individually. And so that's kind of what I did.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I have a recent example of this that like I didn't say anything because I'm also learning, like you've said, of like when it's worth saying something. And I was with a group of people, and they were complaining about, because of COVID, complaining about like their husbands are driving them crazy. And in my mind, I'm like screaming, like, at least you fucking have a husband, But I'm also like, I don't want to be this person that like my friends can't complain about life ever in my presence. Like, and I think that comes with time of being able to, like, I don't always have to be the person that says that out loud in those like moments of casual conversation where you're just struggling because you have not left your house in a year and you are stuck in like, that's hard for anyone. That's hard for everyone. And so I am learning the difference of when it's worth it to say it, and also to hold my tongue sometimes to be like, what is this really providing? Like, other than making them feel shitty and awkward, like that situation doesn't actually make me feel better. Like, I don't need to be the like grief patrol 100% of the time.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think that probably does kind of shift with time. And
I would not have had that perspective early on, for sure.
For sure. And I think sometimes for me, when I don't have the energy, or I feel like I don't want to say something in that moment, then I might just not engage with those people again for a while, because it probably at this point would still really affect me to hear something like that.
Yeah.
How do you manage friends who try to compare your loss to something they've experienced, like a divorce?
I feel like that I saw this question, and we talk a lot about not comparing grief at all, and especially when it's like a divorce versus the loss of a spouse and the differences there. But when I was really thinking about it, I was like, one of the friendships that actually grew after Brad died was a friend of ours who was going through a divorce at the same time that Brad was dying. And we didn't talk about it. It's not like, and I think this was the key for me personally, is we didn't talk about the difference in the divorce or the loss, but we were both just in a dark, grief-filled space. And so I think we were able to coexist and not have to put on these fake smiles. And so our friendship, it grew because of it. I think it would have been different if it was like, I know how you're feeling, and he and his wife are like, his ex-wife are now great friends and in each other's lives in like a different capacity. And it's like there are moments where I'm like, see, it's not the fucking same. And like angry and immature about it. But I think there's a way to like be in your grief together, even if your grief is different. And so I don't want to manage anyone who's feeling grief, even if it feels less so than mine, and they might feel the same.
Yeah. it's funny you should say that because I actually had the same experience. I have like two really good friends our friendships have deepened a lot because of this. And they were both going through like horrible separations for different reasons. I think, like you said, exactly, the key is not really talking about the grief as if it's interchangeable. And I think both of these friends, especially one of them, she always makes a point of being like, I know my situation is not the same as yours. I know that this is not like the grief of the death of the love of my life. Like she always prefaces everything with that. And I really, really, really appreciate that. But yeah, I think just sort of being in these sort of unconventional, unexpected places in our life that we didn't think we were going to be, and watching all these people around us live these like seemingly picture perfect lives, and feeling on the outskirts of that has really connected us together. But yeah, I think if anyone's going to like come into your life and say like, oh, I understand what it's like because I've been through a divorce, like obviously that's not cool, because they're totally different experiences, and you can't compare them in that way. So that, yeah, I think that would be like quite offensive to me if somebody actually like said that to me.
Right. And I actually don't know, like the question is, how do you manage those friends? And I'm like, I wouldn't do it well. Like I'd probably say something and then I would probably keep my space.
I feel like with all of these questions, it's like the same thing. Is this a friendship that you feel like it is worth it to put the effort? Is it worth it to say something? And then if you do feel like it's worth it to say something, then try saying something. Try saying, hey, you know what? Our experiences are not interchangeable. They're not the same. I actually don't appreciate them being compared. I think that they're different. I would love to hear about your experience, but I don't feel like they're the same and they shouldn't be compared. And then see how they respond.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful.
If they respond in a way that's like angry or dismissive, or you know, they get their back up or whatever, then yeah, maybe there needs to be a little bit of space in that. Right. Maybe we should wrap up here.
Yes.
With a jam-packed episode with lots of exciting stuff.
I know. Always. There's always too much to talk about for an hour.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody.
We never know how to wrap this up.
Well, super awkward. We don't know how to wrap it up, but thank you for being here with us and listening and sending all these amazing questions that really challenged us, and hopefully it was helpful, us muddling through these answers.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh my God.
And then we're going to start forever. No.
Like, put your dog in kind of a movie like I can do with my kid.
Still awkward.